Hi, I'm Jonathan, the Cage Stage Crusader. Welcome to my Fortress of Theology. Today, I'll be dealing with some issues of Taoist arguments made against the Transcendental Argument for God and offering a rebuttal. This is part of my pilgrimage through the Institutes of the Christian Religion as I go through it, trying to better understand what it is I believe, why I believe it, and as an exercise in sanctification, I, on occasion, encounter really strong, good arguments against Reformed Christianity, against Calvinism, against Christianity in general. And in this particular instance, the Transcendental Argument for God, made by the Taoists, or a Taoist argument in general, at least. So I'm going to be offering a Taoist critique of the Transcendental Argument for God and a Calvinist rebuttal. So in Christian apologetics, the Transcendental Argument for God, also known as TAG, asserts that the existence of the Christian God is the necessary precondition for intelligibility, logic, morality, and science. In simple terms, TAG claims that unless we presuppose the Christian God, we could not prove anything, because all rational thought and experience would lack a foundation. But how might a devout Taoist, drawing on the highest authorities of Taoist thought, respond to such a claim? Taoism, an ancient Chinese philosophical and spiritual tradition, has a very different worldview centered on the Tao, or also called Dao, often translated as the Way. Using the classic text of Lao Tzu, author of the Tao Te Ching, and Zhuangzi, the Zhuangzi, we will steelman the Taoist argument against TAG. This means I'm going to articulate the strongest possible Taoist case, extrapolating from Taoist teachings why the Transcendental Argument for God is unconvincing or inapplicable from a Taoist perspective. I'll then provide a thorough Reformed Christian rebuttal drawing on the insights of Cornelius Van Til, Greg Bahnsen, Francis Schaeffer, Francis Turretin, John Owen, and John Calvin. The rebuttal will directly engage with the Taoist arguments using worldview analysis to demonstrate any internal inconsistencies in the Taoist position and reaffirm the necessity of the Christian God as the foundation of reason and reality. Throughout, I'll define key terms and ensure a clear comparison between the Taoist and Christian perspective. But before delving into the debate, I need to briefly outline the Transcendental Argument for God, but more importantly, I need to outline the Taoist worldview and set the stage for the exchange itself. So the Transcendental Argument for God is a form of presuppositional apologetics famously advanced by Cornelius Van Til and his more famous students, Greg Bahnsen. Rather than arguing from evidence to God, TAG argues that all evidence and rationality are only possible because God exists. In other words, the argument is transcendental. It inquires into the preconditions of intelligibility. So TAG can be summarized in a few core claims. The preconditions of intelligibility. Human experience requires certain universal, immaterial, and unchanging realities, such as logic, laws of logic, moral principles, the uniformity of nature, like in science, and the dignity of persons. These features of our world, logic, morality, and so on, are called preconditions for knowledge and meaningful experience. The Transcendental Argument asks what worldview or ultimate reality could actually account for these preconditions. The impossibility of the contrary. Van Til and Bahnsen argue that no worldview except Christian theism can provide a foundation for these necessary truths. The attempt to base logic, morality, or scientific order on atheistic or non-theistic worldviews inevitably leads to contradictions or arbitrariness. Greg Bahnsen famously put it this way: the transcendental proof for God's existence is that without him, it is impossible to prove anything. In his debate with an atheist, Bahnsen stated that the non-Christian worldviews cannot consistently provide the preconditions of intelligible experience, science, logic, or morality. In short, if the Christian God did not exist, we would have no reason to trust our logical reasoning. no binding moral truths, and no uniform natural laws. Thus, no proof of anything could get off the ground. God is the necessary foundation. Tag specifically identifies the Christian God as revealed in Scripture, not just a generic deity, as the necessary foundation. This God is absolute, tripersonal, eternal, unchanging, sovereign, and good. Because God created the world and made humans in His image, our minds and our experiences can align with the logical order He built into reality. Because God is rational and truthful by nature, the laws of logic are reflections of His consistent character, and they hold universally. Because God is the moral lawgiver, objective moral values exist rooted in His holy nature, and we have a conscience that recognizes right and wrong. Because God providentially upholds a created order, science is possible. Nature is not chaotic, but operates under uniform laws imposed by God. In Van Til's words, facts and interpretation of facts cannot be separated. All facts already depend on God's order, and no brute fact exists independent of the divine framework. Thus, the Christian contends that every worldview that rejects the biblical God will ultimately undermine the very concepts of truth, logic, and morality that even the critic must use in arguing against God. This self-defeating outcome for the unbeliever is encapsulated in the phrase impossibility of the contrary. Only with God can we make sense of anything, and without God, nothing can be rationally justified. My first batch of homemade wine. It's peach. Tastes like ethanol flavored gasoline with a bit of fruit to it. It's the proper way a Calvinist makes homemade wine. In summary, the Transcendental Argument is an indirect argument. The apologist does not just present evidence for God, but rather asks the challenger to justify how knowledge, reason, or ethics are possible at all without God. The strength of the Transcendental Argument lies in an internal critique of other worldviews. The Christian steps into the opponent's shoes for the sake of argument, as Van Til says, and tries to see if within that non-Christian perspective one can consistently account for logic, science, and ethics. Van Til argued that every alternate system will either be incoherent or borrow elements from Christianity, such as belief in logical laws or human dignity, without being able to actually explain them at all. The goal is to show that Christian theism alone is fully coherent and provides a foundation for the things we all take for granted, the intelligibility of the world and our experiences. Now, with this understanding of the Transcendental Argument in mind, let's turn to Taoism. Taoism represents a dramatically different outlook on reality, knowledge, and the ultimate. I'm going to outline key Taoist distinctives and then craft how a Taoist might challenge the assumptions or conclusions of the Transcendental Argument. If there's any Taoist scholars watching this, please drop a comment in the comment section telling me where I've gotten wrong. Where would you, as a Taoist, strengthen these arguments? I'm going to try to steel man. So what are the key distinctives in the worldview of the Taoism or Daoism is in the ancient Chinese tradition? It means the way, or the fundamental principle behind the universe. The classic texts of Taoism are the Tao Te Ching, attributed to Lao Tzu, 6th century BC sage, and Zhuangzi, writings of Zhuangzi and his school. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing it, I've only got so many teeth left. From the 4th century BC, Taoism has both philosophical and religious aspects, but for this I'm going to focus on the philosophical worldview found in these seminal writings. Several core principles of Taoist thought are relevant. The ineffable Tao, ultimate reality beyond words. Taoism begins with the assertion that the ultimate reality, Tao, is transcendent, mysterious, and cannot be captured in human language or concepts. So the opening line of the Tao Te Ching famously states, "The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name." This means any definition or description we give is already not the Tao itself, because the Tao is beyond all dualities and categories and definitions. The Tao is described as nameless and the source of heaven and earth. It underlies all reality, but in itself is indescribable and inconceivable, subtle beyond all conception. One Lao Tzu passage describes the Tao as darkness within darkness, the gateway to all understanding. Paradoxically, true understanding comes not by analytical description, but by intuitively grasping the hidden formless source. In Taoism, mystery, the unnamable Tao, and its manifested world are two aspects of the same source. This stance already sets Taoism apart from Western logical analysis. Taoism is comfortable with paradox and insists on the limitations of language and reason in apprehending ultimate truth. The Tao as the origin and cosmic balance. The Tao is not a personal creator God, but it is the origin of all things. Chapter 4 of the Tao Te Ching says the Tao is like a well, used but never used up. I don't know who gave birth to it. It is older than God. This striking statement, older than God, suggests that any personal gods or deities as conceived by people are secondary to the impersonal Tao, which precedes all. The Tao is eternal, infinite, and inexhaustible. It is often likened to empty space or a mother. The Tao is called the Great Mother, empty yet inexhaustible. It gives birth to infinite worlds. Rather than creating through will or speech, as the biblical God does, the Tao emanates or gives rise to the universe naturally. All categories of existence emerge from the Tao's unity. Being and non-being create each other. High and low depend on each other. Before and after follow each other. This reflects the famous yin-yang principle in Chinese thought. Opposite forces are complementary parts of a greater whole. Taoism embraces a monistic view. All reality is one. That also encompasses dualities like light, dark, male, female, positive, negative, as harmonizing pairs. The cosmos is a dynamic balance of yin and yang guided by the way. And there's relativity of values beyond good and evil dichotomies. Tao pointedly rejects absolute fixed judgments such as rigid moral distinctions. This doesn't mean Taoism promotes immorality. Rather, it seeks moral categorization. It sees moral categorizations themselves as a symptom of disharmony. Chapter 2 of the Tao Te Ching says, when people see some things as good, other things become bad. Being and non-being create each other. Difficult and easy support each other. Long and short define each other. In other words, what we call good and bad are interdependent concepts created by human perception and language. The Tao itself transcends such labels. In fact, Lao Tzu explicitly says the Tao doesn't take sides. It gives birth to both good and evil. This startling line means the ultimate reality is beyond our human moral dualism. Both what we call good and what we call evil arise within the natural course of the Tao. For Taoism, ultimate reality is beyond good and evil, in the sense that these are distinctions we impose on a unified natural process. The sage ideal Taoist practitioner thus avoids strong judgments and aligns with the Tao, which is impartial. This is not to say Taoism denies kindness is preferable to cruelty. Rather, it cautions that imposing rigid moral orders, laws, and norms can produce their opposites, such as overesteeming virtue makes people cunning. The Taoist ethic is one of simplicity, naturalness, and flexibility. When you are content to be simply yourself, everyone will respect you rather than absolute commands. And then there's the concept of Wu Wei, non-forceful action and natural order, a distinctive Taoist concept known as Wu Wei, often translated as non-action or effortless action. It does not mean doing nothing at all, but rather acting in harmony with the natural flow of the Tao without forced or ego-driven effort. The master acts without doing anything and teaches without saying anything. Practice not doing, and everything will fall into place. The idea is that human striving, cleverness, and artificial rules disrupt the spontaneous order of nature. The sage instead cultivates stillness and intuition, letting the Tao guide action. In governance, Lao Tzu advises rulers to impose as little structure as necessary, so that people remain simple and virtuous on their own. Wu Wei embodies the Taoist suspicion of human artifice, civilization's laws and customs, preferring a return to the state of harmony with the way of nature. This has implications for knowledge as well. One seeks an inner realization of the Tao more than analytical reasoning. Can you step back from your own mind and thus understand things? Asks Lao Tzu. Emptiness, quietude, and openness to the Tao are prized over discursive argument. Now, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, I've heard this before. Where have I heard this stuff before? Probably because you've listened to like interviews or you read one of the books by the martial artist Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee really encapsulated Taoist philosophy and brought it into Western consciousness more than anybody else, really. If you've watched any of Bruce Lee's movies, you've heard these sort of ideas before. Skepticism of language, logic, and conventional knowledge. Zhuangzi and the other great Taoist sage, was especially skeptical of the ability of language and rational thought to capture truth. He was a language skeptic, which means he didn't believe language can convey the ultimate truth of the world. In Zhuangzi's view, human reason carves up reality into distinctions and names that are somewhat arbitrary and often misleading. Different people, cultures, or even species perceive the world differently. Thus, what is right from one perspective may be wrong from another. The idea, the lamb that's eaten by the lion thinks it's evil. The lion that eats the lamb thinks it's good. It's all moral relativism. Zhuangzi illustrated this with whimsical parables and paradoxes. In one famous story, he tells of dreaming he was a butterfly, then awakening and not knowing if he was Zhuangzi, who had dreamt of being a butterfly, or a butterfly now dreaming he was Zhuangzi. This butterfly dream parable challenges our confidence in distinguishing reality from illusion. It suggests that our fixed identity and knowledge could be relative to perspective. Zhuangzi often questions logic and objective truth, advocating a kind of creative relativism or perspectivism. For example, he engaged in friendly debates with a logician friend, Huai Shi, who often, to show the excessive hair-splitting in argument, leads away from the natural spontaneity of the Tao. According to one analysis, human reason sets limits upon everything. Through language, the mind constructs a reality, but this is not real reality. In short, Daoism suggests that true wisdom is wordless and intuitive, not bound by the laws of non-contradiction or abstract categories that Western philosophy holds dear. The more you talk of it, the less you understand, says Lao Tzu of the Tao. Zhuangzi even appreciates a level of chaos in language. He stands out among thinkers for his positive appreciation of chaos, leading to a better appreciation of the nature of reality beyond language. So, to summarize the Taoist worldview in contrast to a Christian one, ultimate reality in Taoism is an impersonal, ineffable force, the Tao, that underlies a fundamentally harmonious but ever-changing cosmos. Truth is not found in propositions or logical proofs, but in attunement to the way. Binary opposites such as light and dark, true, false, good, evil, are seen as relative and flowing into each other rather than absolute divisions. Yin and yang are a dance, not a battle. Human distinctions and assertive knowledge often obscure reality. Thus, humility, simplicity, and keeping an open mind, even open to paradox, is the Taoist approach to wisdom. As we'll see later, these principles lead a Taoist to a very different conclusion about the foundations of logic, morality, and meaning than the Christian apologist who wields the transcendental argument for God. So, having given a summary of both Tag and Taoist thought, Let's see if I can actually steelman a Taoist argument against the Transcendental Argument. If you think I'm getting anything wrong, or I'm being too weak or sloppy, leave a comment in the comment section. Tell me where I'm wrong. Please do it. Prove me wrong if you can. Do it. Go for it. Prove me wrong. So let's imagine how a learned Taoist might respond to the claim that only the Christian God can make sense of logic, morality, and the world. Let's try to use authentic Taoist content, quotes and ideas from Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi to ground this hypothetical rebuttal. Because I've looked, and honestly, there's no formal Taoist critique of the Transcendental Argument for God. Not in any substantive way that I've been able to find online, at least. Now, the Tao is an alternate ultimate reality. So the Transcendental Argument insists that the Christian God as the necessary foundation for all reality and intelligibility. A Taoist sage could respond that the foundation of reality is actually the Tao, not a personal creator deity. From the Taoist perspective, positing a single anthropomorphic God as the source of order is an unnecessary and perhaps arrogant move, where the Tao already accounts for the existence and harmony of the universe. The Tao is eternal and self-existent. The Tao is infinite, eternal. It was never born, thus it can never die. It pervades all things, always present within you, and sustains the cycles of nature without effort. In Taoism, the universe effectively runs on Tao. Why then import the concept of a personal God as an external creator? They would ask. A Taoist might argue that the concept of God is a human projection, a name given to the mystery, but the name that can be named is not the eternal name, as they would reply. In other words, calling the ultimate reality God with various defined attributes is already to miss the mark, since the true source cannot be fully named or characterized. The Tao Te Ching pointedly says, "I don't know who gave birth to the Tao. It is older than God." This implies that even if people talk about gods, behind all those cultural deities lies the more fundamental Tao. Thus, from a Taoist standpoint, the transcendental question, what must be true for reality to be intelligible, can be answered. The Tao must exist. The Tao is the precondition, the self-sufficient way things are. By virtue of its nature, used but never used up, empty but infinitely capable, the Tao provides a wellspring from which logic, natural order, and even morality flow naturally, without needing a conscious divine will to decree them. Moreover, the Taoist might question the necessity in transcendental argumentation. Why must ultimate reality be personal and volitional? Perhaps in an impersonal order, Tao is a more elegant explanation. The Christian God is said to be a personal mind who establishes logic and natural law. But then one must ask, who established God's nature or logic within God? The Taoist would avoid this puzzle by saying that the Tao just is the way it is, spontaneously. So, Ziran, self-so, or naturally thus. There is no further explanation needed beyond the Tao's existence. In fact, demanding a logical explanation for the Tao is misguided. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. By contrast, the Christian insists on explaining the universe via God, but then declares God is self-existent and beyond explanation. A Taoist would smile and say, you are assigning a name and personality to what is ultimately inexplicable. Why not simply acknowledge the inexplicable Tao directly without anthropomorphic detours? It's a very valid question, isn't it? This is the strongest argument so far against the Transcendental Argument, isn't it? Yeah, it gets better. The limits of logic and language, Tag's rationalism challenged. A major thrust of Tag is that the laws of logic are universal, immaterial, invariant truths reflecting God's logical nature, and that other worldviews can't account for these laws. A Taoist reply would be multifaceted. First, Taoism questions whether human logic is the supreme arbitrator of reality. In the first place, Western thought exalts the law of non-contradiction. A cannot be both A and not A at the same time in the same sense, as inviolable. Taoist thought, however, is comfortable with paradox and the union of opposites. Above, it isn't bright below, it isn't dark, seamless, unnamable. It returns to the realm of nothing, subtle beyond all conception. Such descriptions from Lao Tzu challenge binary thinking. The ultimate Tao is neither this nor that, yet somehow encompasses all. It includes all forms in a form that is formless. Taoist writings often make seemingly contradictory statements to jolt the reader out of black and white logic. For example, Zhuangzi deliberately blurs categories. In one dialogue, he argues that from the perspective of the Tao, life and death are the same, or that the one and the many, the whole and the parts are the same. Such assertions are not strict logical identity, but paradoxical pointers to a oneness in which our distinctions dissolve. This mode of thinking is not outright irrational, rather it is aflexible, dialectical logic that values harmony of opposites over elimination of contradiction. A Taoist might cite the famous yin-yang symbol. For instance, within the black yin is the seed of white yang, and vice versa. Reality always contains its opposite, thus the expectation that truth must be either wholly A or not A is, from a Taoist view, an artificial Western constraint. The West has the law of non-contradiction. The East knows nothing of such distinctions. Because of this, the Taoist could argue that Tag's reliance on strict logical consistency is a test of truth, is misguided when dealing with ultimate reality. The Transcendental Argument says non-theistic worldviews collapse into irrationality because they can't account for logical laws. But Taoism willingly embraces a higher rationality where mystery and intuition supplement binary logic. It denies the primacy of Aristotelian logic and knowing the ultimate. After all, the Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao, which implies not only words but logical structures. Behind words are insufficient. Real truth lies in direct experience of the Tao, which transcends logical formulation. A Taoist might even accuse the Christian apologist of a kind of idolatry of logic, clinging to intellectual formulas like Tag itself rather than opening up to the wordless truth. Furthermore, told you it'd get better, Taoism can offer an explanation for why logic works in our experience without invoking God. Logic is a product of the human mind discerning patterns within the Tao, a pattern of the manifested world, the 10,000 things which arise from Tao's unified field. In Zhuangzi's philosophy, logical distinctions are useful within certain contexts. They are part of the way, the Tao, of humans. Conventions that help us navigate daily life, but they are not the ultimate Tao of nature, which is far more fluid and cannot be exhaustively systematized. The Taoist might say we use logic as needed, but we don't assume logic exists as some cosmic absolute emanating from a deity's mind. It is a human tool, a flower of the Tao, one way the Tao functions in our minds. Other creatures might have different logics, or there may be situations like mystical union with the Tao where logic simply does not apply. So in short, the Taoist critique here is that the Tag presupposes a rigid absolute notion of truth and rationality that Taoism itself rejects. The Taoist is content with not knowing, a kind of cultivated ignorance or humility before the mystery. They may quote Zhuangzi, when one fully follows the Tao, you can't know it, but you can be it at ease in your own life. That is, one doesn't need a logical proof of the Tao or God. One needs to align oneself with the way, and the proof is in the harmonious life that ensues. The fruitfulness of living by the Tao is itself the verification of the Tao. This is a very different epistemology from the Transcendental Argument's abstract argumentation. A Taoist could argue that the demand for an incontrovertible logical justification for logic itself, which is what Tag does, is somewhat absurd. It's like using a finger to point at itself. Better to trust the intuitive sense of harmony that the Tao provides. So how is there a unity of opposites versus Christian dualism? The Taoist might further press, told you it'd get better, the Taoist might further press that the Christian worldview, which undergirds Tag, is constrained by a series of dualistic oppositions. God versus creation, true versus false, good versus evil, that Taoism sees as relative. Reality, as Taoists see it, is not divided into absolute categories in the way the Bible presents, such as creator and creature or saved and unsaved. Heaven and earth and I were produced together, and all things and I are one, Zhuangzi famously said in the chapter Qui Wu Lun, or on equalizing things. This expresses a profound ontological monism. Ultimately, all is one within the Tao. Differences we perceive between the self and other physical and spiritual. Between the self and other physical and spiritual are differences of perspective or degree, not ultimate separations. Why is this relevant in critiquing Tag? Because Tag's argument that only the Christian God can provide the basis for logic and morals assumes the Christian framework of reality is correct. A personal, morally perfect logical creator distinct from the creation. Now, a Taoist would challenge that entire framework. Perhaps the Taoist might not directly prove Taoism via logic, as noted they have a very different standard, but they would question the internal coherence of Christian dualisms. For instance, if God is absolutely good, where did evil come from? Christians will say evil is a privation or a result of free will, and so on. Taoism elegantly says both good and evil emerge from the Tao and define each other. The Tao doesn't take sides, it gives birth to both good and evil. This means good and evil are not absolute warring forces, but two aspects of one natural whole. Many Taoist sages argue that by obsessively trying to be good and eradicate evil, societies actually create shadow sides and hypocrisy. A point somewhat echoed by the Christian idea that law can inflame sin, interestingly enough. But Taoists would say that the Christian insistence on an absolute moral lawgiver and judge, God, creates a cosmos where evil somehow inexplicably arose to oppose God, whereas Taoism treats such opposites as inherently cyclical and balanced. A Taoist might thus consider the Christian problem of evil as evidence that the Christian worldview has its own internal tension. How can an all-good, all-powerful God coexist with evil? Whereas the Taoist worldview simply accepts that what we call evil is part of nature, one pole of plurality. This takes the moral sting out of the evil concept and instead focuses on restoring balance. Now, if truth is absolute and exclusive, as in Christian claims, how does one account for the multitude of perspectives and cultures? The Taoist embraces a form of relativism that might argue, for instance, Christians insist their worldview is the only coherent one, but this very insistence blinds them to the partial truth in other worldviews. Zhuangzi's writings promote seeing from multiple vantage points. He famously said we should borrow the perspective of the Tao, which is higher than any one limited human view. You see the influence of Bruce Lee's thinking with his development of Jeet Kune Do and mixed martial arts. He drew from things like modern-day boxing and fencing techniques and adapted that to his own martial art that he was trained in, and essentially created mixed martial arts where you just pick and choose from everything and create a new comprehensive thing. So from the Taoist perspective, many of the squabbles of philosophies each claim to have the absolute truth. It seems comical or futile. Zhuangzi contains dialogues where disputants realize that from the larger view of Tao, their contradictions dissolve. A Taoist might say thus to the Christian apologist, You claim only your God can justify logic and meaning, but that is just one way to explain things, a way that makes sense within your cultural context. The Tao unfolds all cultures and philosophies, each sees in part. The law of non-contradiction you elevate might itself be a parochial habit of the Western mind. The Tao is not bound by it, so neither need ultimate truth be. In other words, the transcendental argument might appear strong only if one already shares the Western logical framework. To a Taoist who doesn't share all those presuppositions, the transcendental argument for God fails to impress. The Taoist would argue they have an entirely different mode of thought that is internally consistent on its own terms, one that values harmony and balance over strict logical consistency. So to illustrate, consider how Taoism handles a concept like change versus permanence. The law of identity in logic says A equals a thing is itself stable. But Taoism emphasizes that everything is in flux. The 10,000 things are constantly transforming. Yet underlying change is a constancy, Tao, underlining of a immutable God. Instead of an immutable God separate from a changing world, Taoism offers immutability and change as two sides of Tao. Returning to the source is serenity. Each separate being is in the universe returns to the common source. All things cycle in patterns, but the Tao endures without being a fixed entity in the way God is described. The Taoist thus claims this resolved the one and the many problem, how unity and diversity relate differently than Christianity. Van Til, for example, argued that non-Christian systems can't solve the one and many philosophical dilemma, while the Christian Trinity does. The Taoist could counter, in Taoism, the one, Tao, and the many things are equal realities. Mystery and manifestations arise from the same source. The Tao is one, yet not a rigid one. It is one that always expresses as many. The many have no existence apart from the Tao, yet the Tao is truly present in the many. This sounds reminiscent of panentheism, or a kind of immanent monism. It may not be logically airtight in Western terms, but it's a worldview where unity and plurality coexist in a balance without needing the construct of three divine persons. A Taoist might not formulate it in Western philosophical jargon, but implicitly Taoism offers an answer to the question of how diversity is grounded. All diverse phenomena are the Taoist spontaneous play. There is ultimately no conflict between unity and diversity, because they require each other. You can't have one without not one, as some later Taoist-influenced Chinese Buddhist philosophy would say. See, I told you, Taoism offers the strongest argument against the transcendental argument for God. These dudes stepped up. They know what they're doing. They know how to argue, at least. You know? I know there's a few of you watching this who are all like, you're starting to shake and quiver because you're getting that cognitive dissonance. Don't. Push through it. Come on. Stop being a pussy. Confront your ideas. If you don't understand what it is you believe and why you believe it, you don't understand or believe anything. So moral knowledge and naturalness without a law-giving God. A core part of the transcendental argument for God is the argument that objective moral values and duties cannot be justified without God. If morals are just preferences or societal constructs, as in atheism or pantheism, then there is no binding ought, no ultimate difference between kindness and cruelty. The Christian apologist says, only if morality is anchored in the character of a holy personal God can we truly say some things are absolutely right or wrong. How would a Taoist respond? Well, they've got several ways. Taoist ethical naturalism. Taoism does not frame morality in terms of commandments from a deity, but it does have an ethical outlook, one rooted in observing nature and living in accordance with the Tao. Instead of objective moral values decreed by God, Taoism trusts an inherent balance of the Tao. Human beings are part of the natural order, and when we act with wu wei, minimal force, and with attunement to nature, the result tends to be harmony, peace, and flourishing. When we act with selfish desire, pride, or excessive inference, we introduce discord. These could be seen as Taoist virtues and vices, albeit not absolutized. Kindness, humility, simplicity, and contentment are repeatedly praised in the Tao Te Ching as in accord with the Tao. In conflict, be fair and generous. In family life, be completely present. When you are content to be simply yourself, everybody will respect you. A Taoist might argue that we do not need a divine lawgiver to tell us these virtues. They are evident from the way of nature and the way of humans thrive. Just as water naturally flows low and nourishes everything, a metaphor for the highest good being like water, benefiting all without contention, so human goodness is a natural quality that emerges when we shed artificial desires and schemes. Thus, morality has a natural bias in Taoism. The way, Tao, itself guides proper behavior, not through coercion, but through some observable fact that some ways of living lead to well-being, harmony, and others to chaos, going against the Tao. Against absolute moralism, the Taoist might further argue that the Christian insistence on absolute moral law, rooted in God's commands, has pitfalls. For one, it can make people legalistic or hypocritical, doing good outwardly but without inner virtue, or harshly judging others. Lao Tzu noted that the more taboos and laws society has, the more thieves and rebels appear. If you overesteem great men, people become powerless. If you overvalue possessions, people begin to steal. This point is that imposing moral hierarchies can breed the very evils they forbid: envy, discontent, rebellion. By contrast, Taoism's approach is to empty people's minds and fill their cores, to help people lose everything they know, everything they desire, so that they naturally do good. This is a very different strategy than issuing divine commandments. A Taoist might thus say, we don't need an external God to threaten or command us to be good. We need to cultivate our inner virtue and understanding. The concept of God's law might even get in the way of genuine goodness by making morality a matter of obedience rather than insight. Do you feel that cognitive dissonance kicking in? Good. You'll feel better after the fight's over. Keep watching. Pay attention. Gets good. The fight is not even close to done. It's just getting good. Good and evil as complementary. As mentioned, Taoism holds that good and evil are human distinctions, not absolute cosmic forces. A sophisticated Taoist view might say, certainly within the human realm, some actions are what we call good: compassion, justice in others, bad, cruelty, and greed. Taoist sages often encourage compassion. For example, Lao Tzu valued gentleness and refraining from harming others, advising rulers to be benevolent and humble. However, Taoists see the roots of good and evil in interplay. Every virtue can turn into a vice, and every vice into some virtue under different conditions. This dynamic perspective cautions against the kind of moral absolutism implied in the Christian worldview. The Taoist might ask, if God is the source of morality, why do moral practices vary so much across cultures and eras? Perhaps morality is at least partially relative to circumstances, an idea more congenial to Taoism. And if the Christian replies because of human sin corrupting perception, the Taoist might nod but respond that the concept of sin, absolute deviation from God's holiness, is itself problematic. Taoism sees wrongdoing more as ignorance or imbalance than willful rebellion against a holy sovereign. People act badly because they are out of alignment with the Tao, not because they are rejecting a known divine law. In Taoism, the remedy is enlightenment and reharmonization, not repentance to a personal deity. This arguably leads to a more tolerant, rehabilitative approach to ethics. Do you notice what's being made in these Taoist arguments? If you followed along, what are they doing? They are enhancing and making of better quality the typical atheist arguments. That's all they're doing. They're taking the general atheist arguments, but adding actual depth and substance to it instead of plugging their ears and screaming, "I don't believe." You know, that's what the Taoists are doing. They're making atheist arguments, essentially. So in summary, a Taoist would argue that meaningful morality does not require a monotheistic God. Humans can discern the natural way for human life, which involves empathy, moderation, respect for the natural world, by observing Tao and following the examples of sages. The preconditions for moral behavior are built into human nature and the cosmos via the Tao itself. The transcendental argument for God's claim that without God there is no basis to call anything objectively wrong might be met with right and wrong are context-bound designations. The Tao encompasses them both. Our task is not to enforce cosmic moral absolutes, but to maintain balance and flow. For a Taoist, a world without the Christian God is not meaningless or amoral. It is simply a world where morality is understood organically rather than legalistically. So Scholastica Thaumaturgus IV, the princess of heretic hunters, has decided to grace us with her awesome presence. Do you have anything to say on the matter? Camera shy, are you? Yeah. So let's do an internal critique of the transcendental argument from a Taoist perspective. Finally, the Taoists might turn the tables on and do an internal critique of the Christian presuppositional approach itself. If a Christian claims their worldview is the only consistent one, the Taoists could probe potential inconsistencies or limitations in it, especially compared to Taoism. Now, this is where the fight gets really good. Incomprehensibility of God versus knowability. Christianity claims an infinite, transcendent God as the source of all meaning, yet finite humans must somehow know this God to have knowledge. Cornelius Van Til himself emphasized that no fact can be understood except in relation to God's plan. Now, a Taoist might see a parallel here. The Tao is beyond full understanding, yet sages align with it. However, the Taoist could question, Christians, you say God's thoughts are higher than ours and his ways past finding out, yet you also claim absolute truth via scripture. Isn't there a tension between God's transcendence and your claims to knowledge? It's an interesting question, isn't it? Taoism is content without mystery, Tao ultimately unknowable, whereas Christianity posits mystery but also clear dogmas. A Taoist might argue that the Christian insistence on doctrinal certainty about God's nature or the origin of logic is hubristic. It's a human attempt to pin down the ultimate in propositions. The Taoist approach, know that you do not know, might be presented as more internally coherent when dealing with an infinite source. In effect, the Taoist could claim Christianity does with God what Taoism warns against, trying to name the unnamable. The Christian would reply that God revealed himself, but the Taoist would question how finite beings can reliably receive and interpret such a revelation without imposing their own biases, just as different sects and religions all claim revelations. And then there's the problem of evil and balance. See, told you the fight's getting really good. The Taoist might also point out that the Taoism naturally accounts for why negative things, evil and suffering, exists. They are part of the yin-yang balance of existence. But in Christianity, evil is a profound problem. How did it arise in a world made by an all-good God? If the Christian answer is with free will, the Taoist could counter that this still implies cosmic dualism or a disruption of God's plan. In other words, the Christian worldview has to allow for a significant aberration, the sin, that it struggles to explain without mystery, Why would perfect creatures choose evil at all? Taoism's worldview is arguably more at peace with the existence of pain and death. It seeks to flow with these realities rather than label them intruders. So the Taoist might claim that the Christian worldview's sharp good-evil dichotomy leads to internal tensions such as theodicy questions, whereas Taoist worldviews has a built-in understanding of polarity, human autonomy, and harmony. The Transcendental Argument for God positions the human mind as only able to function if subordinated to God's mind. A Taoist might sense an authoritarian undertone there. Must we submit to a heavenly king to be rational or moral? They would ask. Taoism celebrates a certain autonomy of the individual in oneness with nature, not in rebellion against heaven, but under a tyrannical cosmic lawgiver. But not under a tyrannical cosmic lawgiver either. You can use the Tao any way you want, says Lao Tzu, implying a kind of freedom within the Tao. The Christian worldview, by contrast, emphasizes human dependence and judgment. A Taoist could argue that the Christian worldview instills fear of hell, of offending God, and conformity, whereas Taoism invites freedom and natural harmony, which might produce a more genuine virtue. This is a value judgment, but it's how a Taoist might press a pragmatic critique. Which worldview truly produces the fruits of peace, compassion, and wisdom? If Taoist sages seem serene and kind, think of the legendary Lao Tzu or a modern Tai Chi master, whereas many religious dogmatists of any creed seem anxious or intolerant. Take me, for example. I freely admit I'm a full-on dogmatic cage-stage Calvinist. I don't give a fuck whether you object or not. Yes, I said fuck. Too bad. Stop crying. VeggieTales was brainwashing propaganda for liberals. So perhaps Taoism has the practical edge. In Taoist terms, truth is validated by its fruits, balanced life, more than by rational debate. So in sum, to steelman the Taoist argument against the Transcendental Argument for God would assert that the Taoist worldview is an alternative that accounts for reality in its own holistic way, rendering the exclusivity of Tag unproved. The Tao is an all-encompassing principle that provides for order without needing a personal planner, for logic while acknowledging logic's limits, and ethics through natural harmony rather than decreed rules. The Taoist denies that the Christian has demonstrated an impossibility of the contrary, since Taoism stands as a viable contrary worldview that the Taoist finds meaningful and coherent. From within Taoism, the demand for that one justify logic or morality by reference to a personal God is answered by pointing to the Taoist presence in all things. The patterns of nature, the mind simply flow from it as naturally as water flows downhill. To a Taoist, the answer is sufficient. The additional layer of a theistic metaphysic is unnecessary and even introduces conceptual problems such as dualism, theodicy, overconfidence in language, and so on, that Taoism itself manages to avoid. So now here's where things start getting really, really good. Where I start pushing back. We go from taking a few good shots to unsheathing the sword. Let's get bloody. So having presented a robust Taoist position, if you think I'm wrong, leave a comment. Tell me where I am wrong. And give me your best. Now let's step back into the Christian perspective and examine this through the lens of presuppositional apologetics. Does the Taoist worldview truly succeed on its own terms? How would Cornelius Van Til or Greg Bahnsen respond to these Taoist claims? Let's provide a fully Calvinist Christian rebuttal, directly engaging with Taoist arguments point by point, and demonstrating from the Christian apologist view where the Taoist worldview might be internally inconsistent or incapable of providing the preconditions of intelligibility it claims to provide. The Taoist critique of the Transcendental Argument is thoughtful and highlights some profound differences in worldview. As Calvinist Christian apologists, however, I need to argue that Taoism, despite its venerable insights, ultimately cannot escape the very problems it identifies. And in practice, it ends up borrowing from the Christian worldview's capital to make its case. Using the very ideas of Cornelius Van Til, Greg Bahnsen, Francis Schaeffer, Francis Turretin, John Owen, John Calvin. Let's respond to the Taoist argument on multiple fronts: the nature of ultimate reality, the status of logic and contradiction, the basis of morality, and the internal coherence of Taoist claims. The goal is to show that the Transcendental Argument for God still stands strong when examining Taoism. Indeed, that Taoism fails its own test of providing a foundation for reason and life, and that only the biblical God can genuinely fulfill that role. Let's engage with each Taoist point raised. The personal absolute God versus the impersonal God. Round one. Let's go. The Taoist posits that Tao is an alternative ultimate reality, impersonal and ineffable, older than God. A Christian rebuttal here draws on a classic argument made by theologians and apologists: the necessity of a personal absolute as the foundation for reality. Cornelius Van Til often pointed out that non-Christian worldviews vacillate between rationalism and irrationalism because they lack a personal sovereign mind at the very top. Let's examine the Tao. The Tao is impersonal. It has no mind. It has no intentions, no ability to communicate or plan. It's a blind, albeit harmonizing force. Now, if the ultimate reality is impersonal, what does that imply about the world and our ability to know it? So you fight these people. You ask counter questions. No ground for logical laws in an impersonal ultimate. Logical laws are about truth, meaning, consistency. In a Christian view, these make sense because they reflect the thinking of a rational God who made our minds to correspond to an orderly creation. But if the ultimate reality is impersonal, like the Tao, logical laws have no anchoring reason for being universally true. They would at best be human constructs or emergent properties of how the human brain perceives patterns. Indeed, the Taoist seems to concede that logic is a human tool, not an absolute. But if that's the case, the use of logic to argue for Taoism or anything loses its validity. It becomes merely a conventional game. The Taoist critique of the Transcendental Argument says logic might just be part of the human realm, However, in making that claim, the Taoist is effectively using logic, making a rational assertion that they expect us to consider true. This is the very borrowing of presuppositionalists talk about. The Taoist must assume the meaningfulness and binding nature of logical coherence, even as they argue it's optional or cultural bound. Greg Bahnsen would point out that if you deny the universality of logic, you can't make any argument without undermining yourself. In Bahnsen's words, addressing an atheist, and it applies here, because Taoism is just the better quality atheist arguments. If the Taoist says the laws of logic are not universally binding, then he refutes himself, for he is trying to give a logically coherent argument against our position while denying the foundation of logic. All right? I'm going to repeat that. If the Taoist says the laws of logic are not universally binding, then he refutes himself, for he is trying to give a logically coherent argument against our position while denying the foundation of logic. Think about that for a moment. If the Taoist says the laws of logic are not universally binding, then he refutes himself, for he is trying to give a logically coherent argument against our position while denying the foundation of logic. We can adapt Bahnsen's statement: without the Christian God, the Taoist worldview cannot consistently provide the preconditions of intelligible logic. Taoism has no personal mind behind the universe to guarantee that truth and reason correspond to reality. Things just happen according to the Tao. So if a human mind's reasoning happens to align with reality, it's coincidence. The Tao didn't intend for us to have true beliefs. Thus, the Taoist cannot ultimately justify why the human mind should trust its conclusions, including the conclusions that Taoism is true. In a Christian perspective, this leads to a deep skepticism or uncertainty that undermines the Taoist's own assertion of Taoism's adequacy. All right, the one and the many problem. The Taoist impersonal unity fails to account for plurality meaningfully. Van Til wrote extensively on the one and the many problem, observing that many philosophies either make ultimate reality an abstract one, losing the reality of particulars, or an indefinite many, losing unity. He argued that only the Trinity, the one God in three persons, provides an ultimate where unity and diversity are equally real and ultimate. Now, Taoists might claim it also has a one and many solution. The Tao is one, and the 10,000 things, the world of plurality, where its manifestation or are its manifestations. But let's look deeper at this. If the Tao alone is ultimate and real, the one, then the distinctions of the world, the many, are ultimately illusory and transient. Indeed, Taoism frequently applies the multiplicity of lesser or deceptive. Remember Zhuangzi's skepticism about differentiations. If that's so, then the varied fact of our experience, you, me, a tree, a tiger, don't have any enduring reality or meaning of their own. They are like waves on a sea that soon return to indistinguishable water. But if no particular maintains a definite identity because all is one Tao, then nothing in our experience can truly be known as itself. Any X can also be not X eventually. Thus collapses into what Van Til called the pure unity trap. If you start with impersonal unity, you can't explain the significance of the particulars. The Taoist said we should transcend distinctions and see all as one. But the very ability to speak and think requires distinction. If the Taoist truly lived out the view that all differences are ultimately unreal, he would descend into silence. But the Taoist does not speak, write books, make distinctions, like between someone who follows the Tao and someone who doesn't. To make those distinctions meaningful, he treats the particulars as real enough. This is an inconsistency. Taoism posits an ultimate impersonal unity, but it cannot escape treating the world as if its specific things and truths existed distinctly, borrowing the idea of definite identity from a worldview like Christianity. By contrast, the Christian Trinity, one God, three persons, provides a model in which diversity is a fundamental unity, since God is not a solitary monad, and creation reflects this structured personal intentions. As Van Til put it, if you start with an ultimate abstract impersonal unity, one cannot account for the fact of plurality, and conversely, pure plurality yields no unity. Taoism leans to the unity strong side strongly. All is one, distinctions are relative. It denies or downplays one horn of the dilemma, But Van Til quips doing so is just an ostrich policy. Reality, your head is stuck in the sand, essentially. Reality still has particulars. Denying them doesn't solve the dilemma. Only a worldview that is both ground for unity and a ground for diversity. In Christian terms, one God who created diverse things according to his plan and gave them distinct natures can fully account for the world. Therefore, the Taoist impersonality fails to give a rational account for why there are many different things with stable identities and how they cohere. It more or less says that's just how the Tao flows, which is not an explanation but an evasion of in the eyes of the Christian apologist. What are you, suddenly camera shy? You bug me. Be on camera and pay attention to you. Now you just don't want to be on there? Kitties are so indecisive. Yeah. Behave. I'll make you listen to Paul Washer again. Now, where was I before I was interrupted? Personality and communication. Another angle. The Tao is impersonal, but we are persons. Humans think, feel, relate, love. We have personal qualities. How can persons arise from a fundamentally impersonal reality? Francis Schaeffer often argued this point. When you begin with impersonal ultimate reality, whether matter or an impersonal spirit like the Tao, you cannot derive genuine personality or values. You inevitably reduce persons to illusion or accidents. Schaeffer noted that Eastern monism makes no distinction between man and cosmos, and that leads to seeing a person, a rock, a carrot as ultimately the same. But we know there is a difference. Persons have consciousness and moral worth in a way rocks do not. The Christian worldview explains this by saying personhood comes from the ultimate personal being, God, who made us like himself. Taoism, by denying a personal creator, really struggles here. If it is consistent, it must say that the sense of self, of individuality, and of moral worth are ultimately illusory. Things to be overcome as one realizes oneness. In fact, some forms of Eastern thought do go that route. Consider Buddhism's no-self doctrine. But the praise of that is steep. It leads to treating the deep longings of the human heart for love, significance, and relationship as a kind of unenlightened trick. Schaeffer observed that proponents of Eastern mysticism and practice cannot live consistently with the idea that personality is not real. They still treat themselves and others as persons with value. He famously said even a Zen Buddhist looks before crossing the street, treating the oncoming bus as distinctly other and dangerous, not merely one with himself in the moment. The Taoist, in arguing against Christianity, uses personal reasoning, presumably cares about truth and virtue, all behaviors of a personal agent, yet his philosophy offers no foundation for the dignity of personhood or the reliability of a personal mind. These are at best transient phenomena produced by an impersonal Tao. As Francis Turretin might point out, even pagans have a natural sense that man has a higher value and conscience inscribed by something above. There is a natural law written upon each one's conscience, which necessarily implies the knowledge of God, the legislator. The Taoist denial of a legislator behind conscience means he undercuts the authority of conscience. Ultimately, an impersonal ultimate makes moral and rational faculties meaningless coincidences. Why trust our mind if it's just a fizz of the Tao? Why feel bound by compassion if compassion is just one polarity that will merge back into cruelty eventually? The Taoist may prefer compassion, but preference isn't an obligation or an objective moral truth. Thus, the Christian contends that Taoism cannot furnish a philosophical ground for trusting our own minds or adhering to moral principles. It ends in a kind of subjectivism or fatalism, go with the flow even if the flow leads off a cliff. Things that go with the flow most easily are dead fish. In short, the impersonal Tao fails the transcendental test. It cannot secure the laws of logic. They become conditional and arbitrary. It cannot ensure the meaningful reality of particulars, leading to either illusionism or inconsistency, and it cannot account for personal, rational knowers and moral agents. By contrast, the personal triune God of Christianity is a concrete universal in Van Til's terms. He is the ultimate one and many, the foundation in whose rational volitional character the norms of thought and value are anchored. Only such a God who speaks and whose word is truth can guarantee that truth is communicable and real. The Tao cannot speak. It offers no assurance that our ideas correspond to reality. Whereas Christians have the concept of the imago Dei, we can know truth because we're made in the image of the truth-knowing God. And what about the law of non-contradiction and logical consistency? The Taoist argument proudly embraces paradox and suggests that the law of non-contradiction is a Western or limited device. They even imply that transcending such logic is a mark of higher wisdom. Now, the Reformed apologist must strongly push back here, because if you truly abandon or relativize the laws of logic, you give up any meaningful discourse, including the discourse you're having right now. As you work through these ideas in your mind as you're listening to me, if you embrace Taoism, you have no actual justification for the discursive thoughts going through your head. So here's a few points. There's the self-defeating nature of denying logic. This is straightforward. To argue ultimate reality transcends non-contradiction, so contradictions can be both true, is to remove any difference between truth and falsehood. If the Taoists were fully correct that contradiction is not a problem, then the statement Taoism is true is equivalent to Taoism is false, which makes the whole conversation kind of pointless. Even Zhuangzi realized a form of this problem. The Stanford Encyclopedia notes that Maoist critique of Zhuangzi took seriously any judgment condemning all judgment as perverse. That is essentially stating the law of non-contradiction in another way. If you say no statements are true, which is a statement, you refute yourself. Likewise, logic is not valid, uttered as an argument, uses logic in the very assertion. It assumes meaningful connection of subject and predicate. The Taoist in our scenario did use reasoned sequences of thought to critique the transcendental argument, expecting those thoughts to be understood logically by us. So on the one hand, the Taoist says logical coherence is not ultimate. On the other hand, he presents a coherent case. This is a fundamental performative contradiction. The Christian apologist can seize on this. Friend, in denying the universality of logic, you've undercut any trust we have in your own words. If contradiction is embraced, then we can equally say your viewpoint supports and denies itself. It has no persuasive force. Van Til argued that all non-Christian thought ends up either denying human reason, irrationalism, or making human reason ultimate, rationalism, and often does both in turns, oscillating to cover weaknesses. Taoism here veers into irrationalism, discounting logic, but the very act of presenting Taoism as an argument to us is a lapse into rationalism, using reason. So this oscillation betrays an inner incoherence, a mark that the worldview isn't truly self-consistent. By contrast, Christianity unabashedly affirms logical non-contradiction as part of God's nature. God is not a God of confusion, so we have no qualms about consistency. The universality of logical order and experience, even if the Taoist says, well, logic is just a convention of human language not built into reality, the Christian can respond, our entire experience testifies that contradictions are false and unworkable. We live day to day assuming the reliability of distinctions. Water is wet, not dry. A poisonous mushroom is not the same as a nourishing one. If someone sincerely acted as though A and not A could both be true together, they would be unable to function. They might as well eat the mushroom that is both deadly and not deadly. Francis Schaeffer often made this point, observing that Eastern-influenced thinkers who talk about all being one and logic being an illusion nevertheless stop at red lights and do not step in front of oncoming buses. In practice, because in the real world, those physical distinctions matter tremendously. There is an antidote along these lines. Schaeffer once dialogued with a guru who claimed the world is illusion. Schaeffer reportedly dropped a pottery piece to the ground, and when the guru instinctively stepped back, Schaeffer pointed out he was living as if distinctions like self versus falling objects are real. The Christian view is that logic, properly used, is an aspect of the image of God in man and is indispensable for apprehending truth. As theologian John Owen noted, God gave us natural light and first principles of reason, so that the mind is necessarily determined to assent unto the proper objects of these principles. It cannot do otherwise. For example, John Owen says, all men, by the light of nature, grasp basic logical and mathematical truths, like whole is greater than part, and basic moral truths, differences of good and evil. These are inbuilt by our rational design. To deny these is to forsake the conduct of nature. The Taoist talk of higher logic or paradox might seem insightful, but the question Van Til would ask is, can the Taoist account for even why paradox or pattern exists? The Christian can. Paradoxes exist because our finite minds cannot fully grasp God's infinite plan. But God knows all in a non-contradictory system. Thus, even paradox to us is resolved in his wisdom. The Taoist has only the Tao just is beyond logic, which is a fancy way of saying my ultimate premise floats reason accepted blindly. Ironically, the Transcendental Argument would call that an arbitrary authority claim, exactly what they accuse others of. The Christian position, by contrast, invites testing of worldviews via reason, through within a presuppositional framework, and claims the Christian worldview saves reason rather than discarding it. The difference can be starkly put. Taoism achieves consistency only by throwing constant consistency out the window at the end. Christianity maintains consistency throughout and explains why consistency matters. The limits of paradox, Christianity versus Taoism. Taoism loves paradox, the unity of opposites, and so on. Christianity also has concepts that transcend simple human reason, such as the Trinity is beyond full human comprehension. Christ's divine human nature is a mystery. But crucially, Christianity's mysteries are not true contradictions. They are harmonized in God's higher infinite logic, even if not by us now. Christianity holds firmly that God cannot lie and truth is not self-contradictory. His word does not affirm A and not A in the same way. So any paradoxes in theology are apparent, not real, due to our limits. The Taoist stance often implies real contradictions are somehow resolved by mystery, which basically means truth itself is inherently contradictory. That's a very different claim. The Reformed apologists like Turretin or Calvin would say that this is wrong because God's own nature is coherent. Calvin argued that even though God is incomprehensible in fullness, he has accommodated truth to our capacity in Scripture and creation reliably. The sensus divinitatis in man, the sense of God, means even idolaters have a seed of truth that there is order in deity, though they distort it. If the Taoists were correct that contradictions are fine, then even saying Taoism distorts truth would have no meaning, since distortion equals truth as well. In essence, allowing contradiction abolishes the concept of truth altogether, which would, ironically, defeat the purpose of Taoist teachings. Why follow the Tao if nothing is truly better or worse? Therefore, the Christian insists that the Taoist must operate within the logical framework provided by God, a framework Taoism can't itself furnish, in order to speak or think at all. Tag is vindicated here. Taoism implicitly presupposes logic by making coherent statements, but it explicitly cannot justify logic's authority. Let's test Taoist morality and meaning. We can turn to ethics and purpose. Taoism proposes a naturalistic ethics of following the Tao and downplays absolute good-evil distinctions. The Christian response can acknowledge the appealing aspects of Taoist ethics, simplicity, humility, connection to nature, but we must assess whether Taoism provides a stable foundation for moral values and whether it can live with its own denial of absolutes. Relativizing good and evil undermines justice. Taoism's view that the Tao produces both good and evil and doesn't take sides might seem to remove the problem of evil. But it does so at a terrible cost. It relativizes evil. If ultimate reality doesn't distinguish good from evil, why should we? The Taoists might say for harmony, but imagine a scenario: a cruel warlord oppresses a village, the villagers suffer. In this situation in need of moral evaluation, is the situation in need of moral evaluation or just part of the yin-yang of life? A Taoist might encourage the warlord to moderate or balance, but can he say the oppression is wrong objectively? Not really. Because in Taoism, there is no value judgment in good and evil ultimately. The Christian finds this deeply problematic. If you cannot name evil evil in a meaningful ultimate sense, you have no basis to resist or correct it. The Bible reveals a God who is light with no darkness in him, who truly hates evil and will judge it. That undergirds a strong moral imperative to seek justice and mercy. Taoism, by contrast, must almost shrug at injustice as part of the balance of nature. After all, predators kill prey. Should we call the tiger evil for eating the deer? A Taoist might analyze human conflicts are similarly natural. This might breed quietism, endure and withdraw rather than actively stop evil. In fact, historically, Taoism and Chinese culture often did encourage hermits disengaging from corrupt society, which is noble on one hand, but also leaves injustice unchallenged. Greg Bahnsen would argue here that our very outrage at real evil, like murder and oppression, testifies to an absolute moral law in the heart that one cannot be adequately explained by an amoral Tao. If a Taoist ever feels something is truly wrong, not just disharmonious, that feeling betrays a moral realism that fits better with theism. As Paul writes in Romans 2, even those without scripture have a conscience that bears witness to moral law, accusing or excusing them. Turretin, commenting on that, said that the Gentile's conscience necessarily implies knowledge of God, the legislator. The Taoist who denies the supreme lawgiver must reduce conscience to a quirk of biology or culture. But then why heed it when it's costly? The Christian can coherently say, conscience is God's voice and doing right matters eternally. The Taoist can only say doing right helps maintain balance, a pragmatic reason, which might not suffice when temptation is strong and personal benefit conflicts with balance. Moral guidance and revelation. Taoist ethics are subtle and situational. Do what is natural, not what is contrived. However, one could ask, how do we know what is truly natural or harmonious in a complex situation? Without an absolute standard, moral guidance can become murky. The Taoist sage might intuit the Tao in a situation, but ordinary people might be unsure. By contrast, Christianity offers concrete revelation. Do not murder. Love your neighbor as yourself, while application requires wisdom. The principles are clear and firm. The Taoist might critique that as too rigid, but at least one knows where one stands. The Christian worldview argues that God's revelation, both in conscience and scripture, gives a stable reference for moral decision-making. Whereas Taoism relies on rather esoteric insights that not everyone might access. Indeed, historically, Taoist philosophy often appealed to a small intellectual elite, while the common folk merged Taoist ideas with superstitions. John Calvin might comment here that without the light of God's word, human thinking, no matter how wise, eventually degenerates. Man's nature, so to speak, is a perpetual factory of idols. If we don't worship the true God, we absolutize something else, like nature or even an emperor. And our thinking gets darkened. The Taoist reverence for an impersonal Tao could be seen as a kind of idolatry of nature's order. Calvin would say the human mind, due to sin, takes that innate sense of divinity and twists it. Thus, Taoism has grains of truth, the existence of a transcendent source, the idea of living humbly. but it misses the mark by not recognizing the personal God behind nature. As a result, their moral compass, lacking that true north, can go astray or become dull. They might accept things God calls sin as just the way things are. Meaning and hope, another ethical and existential point. Taoism offers a kind of serenity in accepting the flow of life and death. Don't fear death, don't chase success. But does it offer ultimate hope or purpose for individuals? In Christianity, each person's life has eternal significance. Choices have lasting consequences, and there is hope of resurrection and union with a loving God. Taoism tends to see individual lives as waves in the ocean. You can arise and you can dissolve back into the Tao. Some Taoist-influenced thought even embraces reincarnation, or just cessation of individuality. That can be seen as peaceful or as nihilistic, depending on perspective. The Christian would argue that the true meaning is found in relationship with the personal God, and the promise that good will triumph over evil and see it vanquished. Taoism's yin-yang implies evil, or what we call evil, will always coexist with good, or what we call good, as a necessary balance, meaning there is no final justice, no ending of the cycle of suffering, just endless ebb and flow. Many people find that unsatisfying at a deep level. And Christians attribute that to our God-given desire for a world set right, as promised in Revelation, new heavens and new earth without tears. Thus, the internal critique is that Taoism cannot fulfill some fundamental human longings. It asks people to squelch them. Don't desire ultimate justice or eternal life, just accept the transient. Christianity acknowledges those longings and points to their fulfillment in God. Internal inconsistencies in Taoism highlighted by reformed analysis. Lastly, we'll examine whether Taoism lives up to its own ideals or whether it inadvertently leans on Christian truths. Taoist use of language and teachings. Taoism says the ultimate cannot be talked about, yet Lao Tzu wrote a whole book talking about it, and Zhuangzi wrote many witty stories about it. If truly words fail, why use them? This could be seen as performative contradiction. The standard Taoist answer is that the writings are just guides to provoke intuition, not literal doctrines. Fine, but still they are using meaningful communication, expecting some degree of accurate conveyance of truth. This presupposes that our minds and language can connect to ultimate reality, at least in an analogy form. Christianity affirms that because humans are made to communicate with God, the ultimate communicator, Taoism has no reason humans should be able to get the Tao at all. It's almost an accident if we do. As one scholar noted about Zhuangzi, despite his skepticism of language, he clearly believed language could hint at truths and wasn't completely futile. Otherwise, why debate, why she, or tell stories? This inconsistency suggests Taoists aren't fully practicing what they preach in epistemology. They rely on the stability and efficacy of language on one hand, while philosophically undermining it on the other. That tension is resolved if we assume there is a logos, word, rational principle, behind the cosmos that makes communication possible, such as the Christian paradigm, not the Taoist one. Taoism's borrowing of morality. Taoists value compassion, moderation, humility, all virtues that Christianity also extols as the fruit of the Spirit. But Taoism has no authority to impose these virtues except a pragmatic one. Society runs smoother, or it feels more natural. Why should a strong man humble himself or care for the weak in a worldview where ultimately all distinctions of strong, weak, self, other blur out? One could argue Taoism inherits moral capital from the general revelation of God. As Turretin and Owen pointed out, even heathens have an indelible sense of some moral law and deity in their hearts, although they don't acknowledge the true God. The kindness found in Taoist ethics may actually reflect the image of God and law on the heart that persists in all people, rather than something the impersonal Tao explains. The Bible would say about Taoist sages, show the work of the law written on their hearts, Romans 2:15, even if they attribute it to the Tao. So Christianity can appreciate Taoist virtue as far as it goes, but asserts Taoists are inconsistently holding to moral truths. compassion is good that their own worldviews cannot account for as objectively true. The historical implication in the need for salvation. From a Christian perspective, Taoism exemplifies the plight of human wisdom without special revelation. It gropes for truth, recognizes some profound things about the world, transience of riches, the need for contentment, the interdependence of opposites. Yet it ultimately misses the most important truth, the identity of the true God. According to Scripture, everybody actually knows God at some level, but suppresses that truth, Romans 1:18-21. John Calvin wrote that there exists in the human mind by natural instinct some sense of deity, and even idolatry is evidence of this fact. Taoism, in refusing to name a personal God, could be seen as a sophisticated form of suppressing that innate knowledge, preferring an impersonal concept perhaps because a personal God brings moral accountability. Calvin observed that people take refuge in subterfuges to avoid the fear of God, yet they cannot fully escape it. For instance, Lao Tzu's idea that the Tao is darkness, the gateway to all understanding, could be interpreted critically as delight in obscurity to avoid the piercing light of a holy God who judges. The Taoist sage humbles himself and forgets himself, which sounds pious, but if it's not in worship to the true God, it's a form of spiritual self-help rather than reconciliation with the Creator. In Christian analyses, Taoism cannot solve the fundamental issue of sin, estrangement from the personal Creator, because it doesn't even admit that issue exists. It diagnoses the human problem as imbalance or ignorance, not rebellion. Thus, Taoism internally cannot explain the depth of evil, it downplays it. Nor does it offer a solution beyond individual enlightenment. The cross of Christ, on the other hand, confronts evil seriously and provides atonement, something far outside Taoist thought. Van Til might say Taoism, as all non-Christian systems, offers at best a band-aid for a mortal wound. It doesn't even correctly identify the wound. The internal inconsistency is subtle. Taoism teaches compassion, yet offers no justice. It teaches balance, yet offers no rationale for why imbalance repeatedly occurs. It yearns for harmony, but fails to acknowledge the disharmony between man and the true God. In light of these rebuttals, the Reformed apologist would conclude that Taoism, while outwardly serene and wise-sounding, cannot provide the preconditions for the intelligibility of human experience as comprehensively as the Christian worldview can. It either undermines or borrows key concepts like logic, truth, morality, and purpose. It borrows logic by using it, but undermines it by denying its universality, an incoherent stance. Only a worldview within a rational divine logos can sustain the universal applicability of logic without self-contradiction. It borrows moral ideals, benevolence and humility, from the law and the heart, but undermines any absolute moral truth by making all values relative, leading to moral paralysis if consistent. Only a worldview with a wholly personal God can affirm real distinctions between good and evil that we innately know. It offers a kind of peace, but it's a peace of resignation. Accept the world as it is. Christianity offers peace with God and the hope of actual restoration of the world to perfect justice. Taoism's internal logic cannot guarantee a hopeful resolution of the human story. Christianity's worldview can, on the integrity of God's character and promises. Thus, by worldview analysis, Taoism fails the transcendental test. It cannot justify why we should have intelligible experience at all. The transcendental argument for God remains robust when we press the question, why is there order rather than chaos? Why does reason work? Why do we have an unshakable moral impulse? The Taoist answers essentially, that's just the mysterious way of it. Take it or leave it. Whereas the Christian answers, because a rational, sovereign, good God made it so and made us in his image, and we can actually know him. The latter answer, we contend, provides a far more satisfying and self-consistent foundation. To borrow Van Til's imagery, the Taoist is like the child who slaps her father's face while sitting on his lap. The very ability to do so was provided by the one being slapped. The Taoist can only argue against God by using faculties and norms like reason and morality that comes from God, even as he denies him. In the end, I invite the Taoist and anybody else to consider that those deep insights of Taoism got right: the insufficiency of material wealth, the need for humility, the profound unity in creation, and their true fulfillment and grounding in the Christian God. Where Taoism says, seek the way and you'll find peace, Jesus Christ says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. The personal Tao, so to speak, can be known and loved, without whom no one finds the Father of Light, the ultimate reality. So I undertook this dialogue between Taoist philosophy and the Transcendental Argument for God. I strove to do justice to the Taoist worldview by presenting the strongest arguments from its perspective and then offering a comprehensive Reformed Christian rebuttal. The Taoist argument leveraged the content of Taoism's highest authorities, Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, to question the necessity and exclusivity of the Christian God as the foundation of logic, morals, and meaning. We saw that the Taoists emphasized the ineffability of the Tao, the relativity of opposites, and the possibility of an ordered cosmos without a personal creator. In response, on drawing from Van Til, Bahnsen, Schaeffer, and others, I looked at each point, highlighting the need for a personal absolute to ground the one in the many, the indispensability of the laws of logic which Taoism must assume, even in denying them, the reality of objective moral values which an impersonal Tao cannot uphold, and the internal tensions in Taoist's claims versus its practice. Ultimately, the presuppositional analysis demonstrates that Taoism, as internally coherent as it may appear, relies on principles it cannot itself furnish. It lives on borrowed capital from the Christian worldview. The intelligibility of truth, the voice of conscience, the expectation of cosmic order. When pressed to the ultimate why, the questions Taoism answers with an admirable but inadequate, it's simply the way things are. Christianity answers, it is the way things are because of the Word of God upholding all things. I've shown that the Taoist worldview, despite its profound observations of nature, falls into inconsistency and cannot provide the preconditions for knowledge and ethics without tacitly importing the very absolutes it denies. In contrast, the Christian worldview, with the triune personal sovereign God, passes the transcendental test. It can consistently explain why the universe is lawful yet personal, why logic and science work, why humans have dignity and moral responsibility, and why there is hope for true harmony, not just in an eternal cycle of balance and decay. As Van Til asserted, anti-theistic worldviews ultimately presuppose theism, even in their rebellion. The engagement with Taoism confirms this. The Tao cannot be the ultimate foundation, but it can be reinterpreted as a poetic glimpse of the true Logos. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and the Word was God. Through him all things were made. The unknown way that Lao Tzu revered finds its fulfillment in Christ, the true way. Therefore, while appreciating the beauty and wisdom in Taoist writings, we need to conclude that the transcendental argument for God stands unrefuted by Taoism. On the contrary, that a Taoist seeking coherence and fullness of truth is, I believe, unknowingly seeking the personal God, who alone is the source of the Tao, the way, the truth, and the life. In the end, only by presupposing the triune God revealed in Scripture can one account for the world as it is. Even a world where East and West, Tao and Logos find their meeting points in the overarching truth of God's creation and redemption. This analysis is aimed to show that the strength of the Christian worldview, one directly confronted with a sophisticated alternative. Christianity not only withstands the challenge, but provides what Taoism and every non-biblical worldview cannot: a consistent, livable, and true account of reality, one in which grace and truth meet and the deepest longings of unity and meaning are satisfied in fellowship with the personal Creator, rather than in the impersonal void. Well, I hope you got something out of this. If you think I'm wrong, drop a comment. Tell me about it. Tell me how I'm wrong. Well, until next time, continue to follow Jesus, who is the true way.